Arrogant mafia boss mocks the blind flower girl. He froze when he heard her last name. He looked at her clouded eyes, noticed the simple cotton dress she wore, and smirked. To Montague, usurper of the most powerful crime syndicate in the city, the blind girl selling wildflowers was nothing more than a momentary diversion for his ego. The gilded dining room was his fortress, a place where he paraded his stolen power before nervous associates. Tonight, he decided the girl would be his evening's entertainment. He had no idea that Noir wasn't just a helpless orphan. He didn't know that mocking her would not only shatter his reputation, but would awaken a sleeping giant he thought he had buried years ago. This is the story of how arrogance crossed the wrong bloodline. If you enjoy stories of hidden identities and ultimate justice, hit that like button and subscribe to see more powerful comebacks like this one. The air inside the restaurant smelled of expensive perfume, aged brandy, and the metallic scent of cold, hard power. For Noir, it mostly smelled like a trap. The fragrance of her fresh wildflowers, lavender, jasmine, and wild roses, clashed with the thick cologne of men who lived by the sword. The warm chandelier lighting cast long, elegant shadows against the gold-framed mirrors, reflecting a world of excess that Noir navigated by sound and instinct alone. This place was a status symbol where the elite gathered to feel untouchable. Rin moved between the tables with a practiced, ghostly grace, invisible until she was noticed, the perfect target in a world that preferred to ignore those it couldn't use. She had become an expert at this, the careful art of being present without being seen, of hearing every whispered secret while appearing to hear nothing at all, and of maintaining a serene smile while standing inches away from the man who murdered her past. The golden hour was fading, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement as Noir arranged the last of her wildflowers. To the casual observer, she was a figure of fragile beauty, her fingers moving with the precision of a pianist among the stems of lavender and wild jasmine. But Rin didn't see the colors, she felt the vibration of the city, the rhythmic thrum of luxury cars, the sharp click of expensive heels, and the heavy, predatory tread of men who thought the world belonged to them. Inside the basket, the petals were soft, but beneath them lay the cold weight of a legacy she carried like a hidden blade. She entered the restaurant, the Gilded Lily, not as a guest, but as a ghost haunting the periphery of the elite. The air here was thick, a suffocating blend of vintage cognac and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. It was a world of old money, where deals were whispered behind silk partitions and hierarchies were reinforced with every shallow bow. Rin navigated the labyrinth of tables by the scent of expensive cigars and the subtle shift in air pressure as she passed high-backed velvet chairs. She was the perfect server of nature's beauty, invisible, silent, and dismissed as a girl whose world ended at the tip of her cane. "Flowers, sir?" "Fresh jasmine for the lady," her voice was a melodic whisper, carefully tuned to sound harmless. She stopped at a table where the laughter was too loud, too jagged. She felt the gaze of the diners, pity from the women, a cruel, assessing indifference from the men. They saw a blind girl selling petals for pennies, likely to pay for a mother's medicine or a brother's future, much like the invisible workers who scrubbed the floors after the lights went out. She accepted their small change with a practiced tilt of her head, a mask of gratitude hiding the sharp intelligence that was recording every word, every accent, and every slip of a name. She knew that survival in this room required a careful dance, anticipating the needs of the powerful without ever intruding on their space. But as she neared the central table, the atmosphere curdled. The air grew cold, heavy with a sudden, suffocating silence that signaled the arrival of a predator. Rin didn't need eyes to know that the man sitting there was the one she had been waiting for. The scent of his charcoal-infused silk and the low, dangerous hum of his voice told her everything. She stood at the edge of his shadow, her basket of petals a shield against the darkness, waiting for the moment the lion would notice the lamb he had once tried to destroy. The silence at the center of the room wasn't empty, it was heavy, a physical weight that pushed against the upbeat jazz playing softly over the speakers. As Noir approached the primary table, the air grew noticeably colder, stripped of the ambient warmth found in the rest of the restaurant. This was the lion's table, the seat of absolute authority where Taegyu sat, surrounded by the curated loyalty of his inner circle. He didn't look like a man who had stolen a kingdom, he looked like a man who had always owned the sun. His tailored suit was the color of a midnight bruise, and the light from the chandelier caught the jagged ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck, a mark of the fire he had used to burn the old regime to the ground. Taegyu was mid-sentence, his voice a low, rhythmic growl that commanded the total attention of the men flanking him. To his right, a man in a sharp gray suit leaned in with a calculating, sycophantic smirk, his eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was properly intimidated. They were the architects of a new, crueler era, and they treated the luxurious dining room like a conquered territory. When Rin's shadow finally touched the edge of their white-clothed table, the conversation didn't just stop, it died. Rin stood perfectly still, her white cane a slender line of defiance against the dark floor. She could feel Taegyu's gaze, it was sharp and invasive, a predator's assessment of a creature too small to be a threat. On the table, inches from his manicured hand, sat a vintage, framed photograph of a young man and an elderly woman, a piece of decor that felt like a deliberate taunt, a reminder of a past he claimed to have erased. The scent of the wildflowers in her basket seemed to wilt in the presence of his heavy, expensive cologne. "Flowers, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in her veins. Taegyu didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving her face, searching for a flicker of recognition or fear in her clouded eyes. He saw only the calm, blank slate of a girl who couldn't see the monster in front of her. To him, she was a prop, a bit of low-stakes entertainment to break the monotony of his power. He set the glass down with a deliberate click that echoed like a gunshot. The lion leaned forward, his mouth twisting into a smirk that promised a very different kind of transaction. He was ready to play with his food, unaware that the girl standing before him was the only person in the world who knew exactly how his story was going to end. Taegyu reclined in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of his arrogance as he gestured for the girl to come closer. To his associates, he was a king, to himself, he was a god, and this blind girl was nothing more than a plaything to prove it. He reached out and snatched a single wild rose from her basket, the thorns catching the skin of his thumb, though his expression remained a mask of cold amusement. "Tell me, little bird," he began, his voice dripping with a feigned, oily sympathy that caused his associates to exchange eager, knowing smirks. "Does a girl like you even know what beauty looks like, or do you just peddle these weeds in the dark, hoping people are as blind as you are?" The man to his right let out a sharp, barking laugh, leaning forward to inspect Rin as if she were a curious specimen in a jar. He reached out to flick one of the delicate petals, his eyes dancing with the anticipation of the drama about to unfold. "Perhaps she thinks she's in a fairy tale," the associate mocked, his voice a sharp contrast to the low, menacing hum of the restaurant. The tragic orphan selling flowers at the feet of the dragon. "It's a touching story, boss. Very cinematic." Rin didn't flinch. She stood with her chin tilted upward, her clouded eyes fixed on a point just above Taegyu's head, giving her an air of unsettling serenity. She felt the heat of their breath, the smell of their expensive wine, and the sheer, vibrating pressure of their contempt. "Beauty isn't always something you see with your eyes, sir," she replied, her voice remaining as calm and cool as a mountain stream. "Sometimes, it's about what is rooted beneath the surface. Even a weed can grow over a grave." The smile on Taegyu's face faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing at the quiet steel in her tone. He didn't like the way she stood, unbroken, unfazed, as if she were the one granting him an audience rather than the other way around. He leaned in closer, the scent of his charcoal silk suit overpowering the fragrance of her jasmine. "A grave?" he echoed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that chilled the air around the table. "You have a sharp tongue for a girl who lives on charity. Maybe I should remind you where you are. In this room, I am the one who decides who grows and who is stepped on. Do you understand, or do I need to speak a language you can feel?" He dropped the rose onto the white tablecloth and crushed it beneath the heavy weight of his palm, the vibrant red petals staining the pristine fabric like a fresh wound. He waited for her to tremble, for her to apologize, for her to break. Instead, Noir simply waited, the silence between them stretching until it became a physical force, the lion realizing too late that he had just invited the lamb to show her teeth. The heavy, oppressive silence at the table was broken not by words, but by the sharp, rhythmic tap of Noir's cane as she shifted her weight. As Taegu leaned back, his hand still resting near the crushed remains of the rose, his eyes wandered to the edge of the table. There, nestled among the fine crystal and polished silver, sat the vintage, gold-framed photograph he had used as a centerpiece for his evening's display of power. It was a black-and-white image of a young man with a sharp, noble jawline standing beside an elderly woman whose eyes held a weary kind of wisdom. For years, Taegu had kept this photo as a trophy, a reminder of the man he had betrayed to seize control of the syndicate. He had convinced himself that the faces in the frame were ghosts, erased by time and his own ruthlessness. But as he looked from the frozen image of the young man to the living, breathing girl standing before him, a cold, prickling sensation began to crawl up his spine. He noticed, for the first time, the identical curve of Rin's brow, the unmistakable set of her jaw that mirrored the man in the photograph, the mentor he had murdered to become king. The associate to his right, sensing the sudden shift in Taegu's temperature, leaned in to look at the photo, his smirk faltering. "Boss," he whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, uncharacteristic caution. Taegu didn't hear him. His world had narrowed to the girl's face and the forgotten faces in the frame. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been mocking a blind girl, he had been mocking the living legacy of the bloodline he had tried to extinguish. Rin, sensing his sudden rigidity, tilted her head slightly, her blind gaze seemingly piercing through his skull. "The faces in that frame aren't as forgotten as you'd like to believe, Mr. Im," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling, melodic silk. "Some shadows are too deep to be burnt away by fire, and some bloodlines are too strong to be broken by betrayal." Taegu's breath hitched in his throat, his fingers twitching toward the gold frame as if to hide it. The arrogant predator was gone. In his place sat a man who finally realized that the ghost he had spent years running from had finally found him, and she was standing close enough to touch. Taegu's fingers hovered over the gold-framed photograph, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the table. The ghost of his mentor seemed to stare back at him, mocking the hollow crown he had stolen. To hide his sudden tremor, he reached for the crushed remains of the wildflower he had destroyed moments ago. He held the bruised, red pulp between his thumb and forefinger, looking up at Noir with a desperation masked as renewed cruelty. "You speak of bloodlines and shadows," he spat, his voice regaining its sharp, jagged edge. "But a rose is just a rose. Once it's plucked, it withers. Once it's crushed, it's trash. Just like your father." The associate to his right let out a forced, nervous chuckle, eager to follow his leader's lead. "Exactly, boss. A dead man's name doesn't pay for the wine." He turned back to Rin, his voice a high-pitched sneer. "What's the price of this garbage, girl? Give us a number so we can get back to real business. Does a dozen of these cost as much as the dirt they grew in?" He reached into his pocket and tossed a handful of crumpled bills onto the table, the paper landing in the spilled wine and the smear of flower petals. Rin did not move to touch the money. She stood in the center of their circle, her presence expanding until the luxury of the room felt like a cheap stage set. "The price of a rose is not found in the coin you throw," she said, her voice vibrating with a quiet, terrifying authority. "The price is measured in what it cost to take it. For my father, the price of his life was your betrayal. For these flowers, the price is the blood that nourished the soil where you buried him." Taegu felt the air leave his lungs. Every word she spoke felt like a needle threading through his past, sewing his sins directly to his skin. He looked at the money soaking in the red stain on the tablecloth, and for a fleeting, horrific second, it didn't look like wine, it looked like the lifeblood of the man he had murdered. The associate's smirk died instantly as he realized the girl wasn't looking for a handout, she was delivering a bill. You think you can come here and talk to me about prices? Taegu hissed, though the steel in his voice was beginning to rust with fear. I bought this city with blood. I own every rose and every grave in it. Ownership is a temporary illusion, Mr. Im, Rin replied, her clouded eyes seeming to turn a deeper, colder shade of gray. You didn't buy the city, you merely rented it. And tonight, the lease is up. She reached into her basket and pulled out a single, pristine white lily, placing it gently atop the pile of blood-stained cash. It was a funeral flower, a silent, beautiful promise that the debt he owed was finally being called in. The white lily sat atop the blood-soaked cash like a headstone, drawing every eye in the room to the center of the table. Taegu felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline, the air in the luxurious restaurant suddenly feeling thin and oxygen-starved. He looked at the flower, then at the girl, his voice a jagged rasp of its former self. You've had your fun, girl, he hissed, trying to reclaim the fragments of his shattered ego. Pick up your weeds and get out before I have my men show you what happens to people who forget their place. No, Rin did not move. She didn't flinch at the threat or reach for the basket. Instead, she straightened her back, her presence suddenly towering over the seated men. The waitress facade vanished, replaced by a chilling, regal stillness. You speak of forgetting places, Taegu, she said, using his name without a title for the first time, a social transgression that made the associates gasp. But you are the one who has forgotten the foundation of the house you live in. Taegyu's face contorted with fury, his hand tightening into a fist. Who do you think you are? He roared, the crystal glasses on the table rattling. You're a nameless beggar in a room full of kings. Nameless? Rin echoed, her voice dropping to a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She leaned in, her clouded eyes focusing on a point just inches from his own, forcing him to see the ghost of his mentor in her gaze. The world might have forgotten, and you might have tried to bury it in a shallow grave, but blood always remembers its origin. The restaurant fell into a deafening, vacuum-like silence as she took a slow, deliberate breath. My name is No Rin, she stated, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade. Daughter of No Kongho. The man who gave you everything you stole. The man whose last name you are currently trembling to hear. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Taegu froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as the color drained from his face, leaving it the gray of a sun-bleached bone. The associate to his right stopped breathing, his hand frozen halfway to his glass. In the underworld, the name No wasn't just a surname, it was a mandate of heaven, a legend of honor that Taegu had spent a decade trying to erase with fire and blood. To hear it spoken by the very girl he had just mocked, the blind flower girl he had treated like dirt, was to hear the sound of his own execution. The lion was gone, in his place sat a terrified usurper who finally realized that the girl wasn't selling flowers, she was delivering his final rites. The gray pallor of Taegu's skin made the ink of his neck tattoo look like a bruise on a corpse. His hand, which had been so quick to crush the life out of a rose, now hung limp and useless at his side. In the underworld of Seoul and the hidden backrooms of Manhattan, the name No Kongho was not merely a name, it was a legend of unshakable honor and absolute power. It was the name of the man who had picked Taegu up from the gutter, taught him the language of the shadows, and trusted him with the keys to the kingdom. Taegu looked at Rin, and for the first time, he didn't see a blind girl or a lowly flower seller. He saw the ghost of the mentor he had stabbed in the back 10 years ago to ascend his blood-stained throne. He saw the same quiet ferocity in her unseeing eyes that Kongho had possessed, a depth of character that no amount of stolen wealth could ever buy. The restaurant, with its gold-framed mirrors and expensive beef, suddenly felt like a tomb. He realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't been the hunter tonight, he had been the prey being led into a trap by a ghost. His mind raced, a frantic animal trapped in a corner. He had been told the entire No family was gone, wiped out in the fire he had ordered to cover his tracks. He had spent a decade convincing himself that he was the rightful heir, but the girl standing before him was living proof of his fraud. The associates at the table began to shift uncomfortably, the sycophantic smirks replaced by the wide-eyed realization that they were sitting next to a dead man. They knew the laws of the old regime. A drop of no blood carried more weight than a mountain of Taegye's gold. You died, Taegye whispered, his voice a pathetic reed. The house in Busan, there were no survivors. A house is just wood and paper, Taegye, Rin replied, her voice echoing with 1,000 years of ancestral weight. But the spirit of No Kongho was never in the walls. It was in me. You thought my blindness was a curse you could exploit, but it was my greatest shield. While you were busy looking at your reflection in stolen mirrors, I was listening to the world you thought you owned. I heard every deal, every betrayal, and every secret you whispered into the dark. She took a step closer, the scent of her jasmine flowers suddenly smelling like the incense at a funeral. I am the ghost you couldn't kill, and tonight, I've come to take back what belongs to my father. Taegye's first instinct was violence, but as he moved to stand, his knees buckled under the sheer weight of No Rin's presence. The shift in power was not loud or explosive, it was a silent, atmospheric realignment. The restaurant's lighting seemed to dim around the edges, focusing a harsh, singular spotlight on the girl who had been invisible only moments ago. Rin did not reach for her cane. Instead, she stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her head tilted as if listening to a symphony no one else could hear. You think your men will move for you, Taegye? She asked, her voice vibrating with a newfound, terrifying clarity. Listen. Taegye looked toward the entrance, where his two most trusted enforcers usually stood like stone gargoyles. They weren't moving. They were staring at Rin with a mix of reverence and ancestral fear. They had served No Kongho long before they were bought by Taegye's stolen silver, and the sound of the No name had awakened a loyalty that had only been dormant, never dead. The associate to Taegye's right tried to reach for the concealed weapon beneath his jacket, but his hand froze when a server, a man who had spent the last hour pouring wine with a bowed head, placed a firm, heavy hand on his shoulder. The entire staff of the Gilded Lily had stopped moving, their eyes fixed on the blind girl. Rin reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the gold-framed photograph. She didn't fumble, her movement was precise, targeted. She picked up the frame and turned it toward Taegye. My father taught me that a true leader doesn't need eyes to see a traitor. He needs ears to hear the heartbeat of the city. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her clouded eyes seeming to sharpen, piercing through the veil of her disability. I am not acting blind, Taegye. I am seeing the world exactly as it is, a place where you no longer belong. The lion was now a cornered rat. He looked around his fortress and realized every exit was manned by people who were no longer his. The status twist was complete. The fine crystal, the premium beef, and the hand-painted murals were no longer symbols of his reign, they were the walls of his cage. Rin leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that only he could hear. The girl you mocked is the one who will watch you lose everything. And you won't even see it coming. She set the photo back down, but this time, it faced him like a judge's gavel. The transition was absolute, the flower girl had become the sovereign, and the boss was nothing more than a ghost in his own house. The shift in atmosphere was so total that it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Taegye, realizing his psychological hold was disintegrating, let out a desperate, guttural roar. Kill her, he screamed, his voice cracking with a cowardice he could no longer hide. I don't care who she is. Kill everyone in this room. The violence erupted with the suddenness of a lightning strike, but it did not go according to Taegye's design. His personal bodyguards, two hulking men trained for cold-blooded execution, reached for their holsters, but they were swarmed before their fingers could touch steel. The waiters, who had been hovering in the shadows, moved with a lethal, synchronized efficiency that spoke of military training. A heavy oak tray was slammed into the temple of one guard, while another was tackled through a hand-painted screen, the delicate wood splintering like bone. Chaos surged through the dining room as the wealthy associates scrambled for safety, their expensive suits torn and stained with spilled wine. Crystal glasses shattered, and silver platters clattered across the floor, but amidst the swirling riot, Noir remained a fixed point of absolute stillness. She didn't move an inch, her white cane held lightly in her hand, her expression one of serene, almost terrifying peace. The man who had been mocking her moments ago, the sycophantic associate in the gray suit, tried to lung for her, his face twisted in a desperate attempt to regain favor with his boss. He didn't even get close. A firm hand grabbed him by the throat and slammed him onto the table, his face landing squarely in the remains of the crushed rose. Taegu scrambled backward, his chair toppling over as he realized his fortress had become his cage. He reached for a heavy glass carafe to throw, but his arm was caught mid-air by the restaurant's manager, a man Taegu had treated like a servant for years. The manager's grip was like an iron vice. The No family always paid their debts, Taegu, the man whispered, his eyes burning with a decade of suppressed rage. It's time we settled yours. Across the room, the heavy entrance doors were kicked open, but it wasn't the police who entered. It was a phalanx of men in dark coats, the old guard of the Busan Syndicate, men who had disappeared into the shadows when Kong Ho fell. They moved through the room not as rioters, but as a cleaning crew. One by one, Taegyu's remaining loyalists were disarmed and forced to their knees. The riot was over as quickly as it had begun, leaving the restaurant in a state of ruin. Rin stepped over a pile of broken porcelain, her movements unerringly accurate. She stopped just inches from where Taegu lay trembling on the floor, the lion reduced to a heap of expensive silk and terror. You called for a riot, Taegu, she said, her voice cutting through the ringing silence. But all you've done is wake the house my father built. And now, the house is hungry. The sirens wailed in the distance, a rising chorus of high-pitched laments that signaled the end of the night's lawlessness. Inside the wreckage of the dining room, the air was heavy with the smell of ozone and spilled Cabernet. Taegu scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the back exit, but Noir remained between him and the door, a silhouette of absolute calm against the flickering chandelier. The police are coming, Taegu, she said, her voice a cool breeze amidst the heat of the ruined room. But they aren't coming for the lion. They're coming for the thief who broke into a house that didn't belong to him. Taegu didn't wait to hear more. He lunged toward the side service entrance, shoving past a dazed associate, but as he reached the heavy velvet curtains, he found them blocked by the very manager who had held his arm moments ago. The man didn't move, he simply stood there, a living wall of the old guard. Taegu spun around, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, only to find the restaurant's main floor suddenly, eerily empty. The phalanx of dark-coated men had vanished into the shadows of the dark wood paneling as if they had never existed. Rin, too, began to move. She didn't flee, she simply stepped into the periphery of the gold-framed mirrors, her white cane tapping a rhythmic, haunting beat against the floor. She moved with an unerring certainty, guided by a map of the building she had memorized in the dark years of her exile. Tonight was just the opening act, she whispered as she reached the kitchen's rear door. The blue and red lights of the patrol cars were now dancing against the hand-painted murals of the lobby. You think you're escaping into the night, but you're just running deeper into the maze I built for you. As the first officers burst through the front doors, weapons drawn, they found only a shivering, disgraced man standing amidst broken glass and a single white lily. Noir was gone. She slipped into the cool night air of the Manhattan alleyway, her cotton dress fluttering in the wind. She didn't look back at the chaos she had orchestrated. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't just a girl selling flowers in the dark. She was the ghost who had finally stepped out of the grave, and as she disappeared into the city's fog, the first escape was not a retreat, it was a declaration of war. By the time the police began their questions, the only trace of her was the scent of jasmine lingering in the air and a Mafia boss who had finally learned that some shadows have teeth. The safety of the fog-drenched alleyway swallowed Noir, but her work was far from over. She navigated the labyrinthine streets of the city not by sight, but by a mental map etched in years of darkness and precision. Soon, she reached a nondescript brownstone in a neighborhood that time had forgotten. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of old paper and ozone, the scent of her private sanctuary. This was the Archive of Sins, a room where the last decade of Tegu's life had been meticulously deconstructed into a tactile library of braille and recorded whispers. Rin moved to a wall of shelves, her fingers dancing over the raised dots of leather-bound ledgers. These were the blind girl's records, information Tegu had practically handed to her while he sat in the restaurant, assuming she was a deaf-mute prop to his ego. To the world, she was a helpless flower girl. To the archive, she was a master weaver. Every time Tegu had whispered a bribe to a city official, Rin had been there, leaning against a nearby lamp post. Every time he had ordered a shipment of illicit cargo, she had been sitting on a bench, her clouded eyes focused on nothing, while her ears captured the frequency of his voice and the specifics of his greed. She pulled a heavy file from the shelf and opened it, her sensitive fingertips tracing the timeline of the night her father died. She had documented every asset Tegu had liquidated and every loyalist he had threatened into silence. Beside the ledgers sat a row of reel-to-reel tapes, audio recordings of The Gilded Lilies, most private booths. Tegu had loved that restaurant because it felt like a fortress, never realizing that the very walls had ears, and those ears belonged to the girl he had just called a nameless beggar. The archive was more than just data, it was the anatomy of a monster. Rin felt the textures of bank account numbers, shell company names, and the shipping manifests of the Busan syndicate. She had been invisible for so long that she had become the ultimate witness. As the police across town struggled to make sense of the ruined restaurant, Rin sat in the silence of her vault, cross-referencing the fear she had heard in Tegu's voice with the evidence she held in her hands. The Archive of Sins was complete. The hunter had spent 10 years building a throne out of stolen bones, never realizing that the girl in the shadows had been counting every single one. She closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. The evidence was ready. All that remained was to ensure the world knew that the lion had no claws left to hide with. The morning after the ruin of the Gilded Lily, the world felt fundamentally different to Tegu. He sat in his high-rise office, a glass-walled fortress overlooking the city, but the transparency that once represented his oversight now felt like a vulnerability. Every time the elevator chimed, his hand twitched toward the drawer where he kept a silenced pistol. Every time his phone buzzed, he expected to hear not a nervous associate, but the melodic, chilling silk of a voice he hadn't been able to purge from his mind. No, Rin was gone, but she had left a permanent stain on his psyche. He looked at the vase of fresh flowers on his desk, an arrangement of lilies and wild roses his assistant had placed there to brighten the room, and he felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. To anyone else, they were just plants. To Tegu, they were a signature, a mocking reminder that the girl with the clouded eyes could find him anywhere. He swept the vase off the desk in a fit of rage, the water soaking into the expensive carpet like a spreading shadow. He began to see her everywhere. A girl with a white cane crossing the street 3 blocks away made him freeze behind his tinted car windows. The scent of jasmine in the hotel lobby made him bark orders at his guards to clear the floor. His paranoia was a rot, eating away at the cold logic that had once made him a formidable leader. He called for a secret meeting of his lieutenants, but as he looked around the room, he realized he didn't recognize the men he had bought. Were they still his? Or were they, like the restaurant manager, merely waiting for the right moment to reveal their true colors? "Find her," he hissed, his voice trembling with a frantic energy that made his men exchange uneasy glances. "Find her and bring me her head. I want the archive. I want the girl. I want this ghost gone." But the ghost was already in the room. He felt it in the way the air seemed to grow thin, in the way the sunlight hitting the glass felt like a spotlight on a stage. He suspected his phones were tapped, his cars tracked, and his bank accounts watched. He was the head of a multi-million-dollar empire, yet he felt like a prisoner in a cell of his own making. The irony was a bitter pill. he had spent a decade making sure Noir was invisible, only for her invisibility to become the very thing that was destroying him. As night fell over the city, Taegu stayed in his office, the lights off, watching the shadows for a girl who didn't need light to see exactly where he was hiding. In the heart of the city, tucked away in an office that didn't appear on any official blueprints, a man sat watching a bank of monitors that flickered with the blue-gray light of surveillance feeds. He was known only as the General, a man whose career had been built on the quiet containment of monsters like Taegu. For 10 years, he had been the silent architect of Noir's survival, the one who had pulled her from the wreckage of the Busan fire and taught her that information was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. The General didn't look like a warrior. He was a man of silver hair and sharp, tailored waistcoats, his hands steady as he poured a cup of barley tea. When the door to the office opened, he didn't turn around. He didn't need to see the girl with the white cane to know she had arrived. He could hear the weight of her footsteps, confident, purposeful, no longer the hesitant tread of a girl hiding in the dark. The restaurant was a risk, Rin, the General said, his voice a low vibration that carried the authority of 1,000 battlefields. You stepped into the light before the sun was fully up. Rin moved to the center of the room, the scent of wild jasmine following her like a loyal companion. He needed to feel the chill of the grave, General. Paranoia is a faster teacher than justice. By the time the law reaches him, he will already be a hollow man. The General finally turned, his eyes reflecting the data streaming across the screens, the archive of sins she had compiled, now being uploaded to secure servers across 3 continents. He had been her guardian, the one who provided the sensors, the recording devices, and the safe houses, but tonight, he saw that the student had surpassed the master. He looked at the daughter of his old friend, No Kong-ho, and saw not a victim, but a sovereign in exile. Taegu is burning his bridges, the General noted, gesturing to a screen showing the frantic movement of Mafia couriers. He thinks he can run. He doesn't realize that every path he takes has been paved by us. He reached into a drawer and produced a small, minimalist wooden symbol card, the same emblem that had appeared on the table at the restaurant. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. The old guard is ready. The loyalists are tired of living in the shadows of a usurper. You've given them a reason to stand. Rin took the card, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves of her father's seal. The secret guardian had kept her safe for a decade, but as she stood in the glow of the monitors, they both knew the time for protection was over. It was time for the hunt. He mocked my father's name, she whispered, the cold steel returning to her voice. Now, he will learn that the no name isn't just a legacy. It's a sentence. Taegu's desperation finally overrode his survival instinct. Driven by the suffocating weight of his own paranoia, he decided to strike at the only vulnerability he thought Noir had left, her public identity. He sat in the back seat of his black sedan, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a tablet as he gave the order. He would not wait for his legal team or the slow wheels of underworld politics. He instructed his digital team to leak a falsified dossier to the press and the police, framing the blind flower girl as a high-level corporate spy and a blackmailer who had targeted the city's elite for years. He wanted to strip away her cloak of innocence, to make the city a hunting ground where she had nowhere to hide. It was a classic move from the usurper's playbook, use the system to crush the individual. He smirked as he watched the first sensationalist headlines flicker onto the news feeds. To him, this was the masterstroke that would force the ghost out of the shadows and into a prison cell. He believed that by attacking her character, he would regain the moral high ground in the eyes of his associates. But Taegu had made the fatal mistake of a man who plays a game he no longer understands. By releasing the dossier, he unwittingly provided the final piece of the puzzle the General and Rin had been waiting for. The spy allegations required a formal investigation, one that granted the authorities, and the General's secret task force, legal access to the very servers Taegu used to distribute the lies. He had opened a digital door to his own empire, thinking he was closing one on Rin. As he watched the news from his high-rise office, expecting to see Rin being led away in handcuffs, the broadcast shifted abruptly. The leaked documents began to transform in real time, replaced by the archive of sins she had meticulously prepared. The public didn't see a story about a blackmailing flower girl, they saw a verified, cross-referenced ledger of Taegyu's 10 years of theft, arson, and murder. He had provided the medium for his own public execution. Rin sat in a quiet park nearby, the scent of evening rain and damp earth filling her senses. She listened to the frantic notifications on the phones of passers-by, the digital chorus of a kingdom falling apart. Taegyu had tried to frame the lamb, but in his arrogance, he had handed the butcher the knife. She stood up, her white cane tapping softly against the pavement, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. The usurper's mistake wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. He truly believed that a lie told loudly enough could drown out the truth of a daughter's memory. He was about to learn that the truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to wait. The digital exposure of the archive of sins acted as a silent beacon, calling home the loyalists who had been scattered to the winds when the No family fell. Across the city, in darkened backrooms and humble tea shops, men and women who had spent a decade bowing their heads to Taegyu's tyranny began to look up. It was the gathering storm, a slow-building pressure in the atmosphere that preceded a cleansing flood. They didn't need a public announcement, they felt the shift in the vibration of the underworld. The scent of wild jasmine seemed to permeate the streets, a floral ghost that signaled the return of the rightful bloodline. Old guard captains, men with scarred hands and memories of a more honorable era, began to meet in the dead of night. They gathered not in gilded restaurants, but in the places Taegyu had deemed beneath his notice, underground docks, quiet shrines, and the very flower markets where Rin had spent her exile. They brought with them the missing pieces of the puzzle, keys to hidden armories, codes to encrypted accounts, and the names of the ghost soldiers who had never truly accepted the usurper as their king. The atmosphere was thick with the electric hum of anticipation, the collective breath of 1,000 people held in check, waiting for the final signal. In his glass-walled fortress, Taegyu watched the city lights and realized they no longer looked like jewels in his crown. They looked like eyes. Every flickering neon sign and every passing headlight felt like a witness to his impending collapse. He tried to call his inner circle, but the lines were dead, or worse, answered by a heavy, accusing silence. His empire was no longer a solid structure, it was a sandcastle being eroded by an incoming tide. He could feel the loyalty of his remaining guards curdling into fear, their gazes lingering too long on the exit. No Rin stood on the rooftop of the general's sanctuary, the wind whipping her hair like a dark banner. She didn't need to see the storm to know it was here. She could hear the rhythmic tapping of rain starting to fall against the metal vents, a sound that mirrored the thousands of footsteps now moving in unison toward the center of the city. The storm was no longer a metaphor, it was a living, breathing force of justice fueled by a decade of suppressed grief. "The wind is changing, father," she whispered into the cold air. The gathering was complete. The shadows had finished their work, and as the first cracks of thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline, the storm broke, and the hunt for the usurper began in earnest. The storm had turned the city into a blurred landscape of steel and water, but inside the executive suite of the Yonggang headquarters, the silence was absolute. Taegyu sat behind his expansive mahogany desk, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked like a man already under a shroud. The phones had stopped ringing hours ago. Even the hum of the ventilation seemed to have died, leaving him in a vacuum of his own making. The elevator chimed, a solitary, haunting note that echoed through the empty marble lobby outside his office. Taegyu's hand flew to the drawer, his fingers trembling as they closed around the cold grip of his pistol. He watched the heavy oak doors, expecting a phalanx of police or a squad of the old guard. Instead, the doors remained closed, and a soft, rhythmic sliding sound came from beneath them. A single, thick envelope of handmade mulberry paper slid across the floor, coming to rest on the plush carpet. It was stark white, a jarring contrast to the shadows of the room. Taegu approached it with the hesitant steps of a condemned man. With shaking hands, he tore it open. There was no letter inside, no list of demands, and no legal threats. There was only a single black rose, its petals so dark they appeared velvet, still glistening with droplets of rain. Tucked into the stem was a small, wooden card, the seal of the No family. On the back, written in a delicate, precise script that felt as sharp as a needle, were 4 words: "The table is set." It was the final invitation. It wasn't a request, it was a summons to the place where his rise had begun and where his fall would be finalized. Taegu looked at the black rose and realized the blind girl was granting him one final mercy, the chance to face his past before the world tore him apart. He didn't need to check the address. He knew the scent of jasmine and blood would lead him back to the ruins of the restaurant where he had first mocked the heiress of the empire he had stolen. He slumped back into his chair, the black rose heavy in his palm. The invitation was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. By sending it, Rin had stripped him of his last defense, his hiding place. Stay and wait for the police to break down the doors, or he could walk into the trap with the dignity of a man who once called himself a king. As the thunder rattled the glass of his fortress, Taegu stood up and reached for his coat. The lamb had finished the hunt, now, she was simply waiting for the lion to walk into the light. The doors to the Yonggang headquarters did not groan or resist, they yielded with a silent, heavy reverence as No Rin stepped inside. She did not enter with a flurry of soldiers or the clamor of a raid. She walked alone, her white cane tapping a steady, rhythmic pulse against the polished obsidian floors. The vast marble lobby, once a cathedral to Taegu's ego, was hollow. The guards who had once stood at attention had vanished, replaced by a haunting, expectant stillness. Rin could feel the cold draft of the high ceilings and the familiar scent of her father's favorite sandalwood incense drifting from the upper floors, a scent that had been suppressed for a decade, now reclaimed. She navigated the grand staircase not as a visitor, but as the master of the house. Every step was an echo of the past, a reclamation of the territory Taegu had tried to paint over with his own gaudy colors. As she reached the executive level, she felt the presence of men in the shadows, the old guard, standing like statues in the darkened hallways. They did not move to stop her, instead, as she passed, she heard the soft, synchronized rustle of heads bowing in the dark. The blind girl they had once helped to hide was now the sovereign they had been waiting to serve. She pushed open the double doors of the boardroom, the heart of the empire's power. The room was vast, dominated by a long table of dark walnut that stretched toward the city skyline. At the far end, Taegu sat in the high-backed chair that had once belonged to No Kongho. He looked small, his silhouette dwarfed by the massive windows and the flickering lightning of the storm outside. He did not reach for his weapon. He simply watched her approach, his breath hitching as she moved toward the head of the table with the unerring grace of a woman who didn't need eyes to know she was home. Rin stopped at the chair directly opposite him. She reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood her father had commissioned. The throne was never the chair, Taegu, she said, her voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room. It was the heart of the person sitting in it. You sat here for 10 years, and yet, the room remained empty. She moved around the table, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. As she reached the head of the table, Taegu instinctively recoiled, sliding out of the seat as if the leather had turned to fire. Rin did not sit immediately. She stood behind the chair, her hands resting on its back, her clouded eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her childhood. The power shift was physical, a tidal wave of authority that pushed Taegu toward the door. The usurper was out, the heiress had returned. The throne was no longer a piece of furniture, it was a judgment. The digital screens that lined the boardroom walls, usually flickering with fluctuating stock prices and cold surveillance feeds, suddenly pulsed with a uniform, blinding white light. Taegu scrambled back against the floor-to-ceiling windows, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He looked at the monitors, expecting to see Rin's face, but what he saw was far more devastating. It was his own voice, recorded in the high-fidelity clarity of the archive, filling the room and broadcasting simultaneously to every mobile device and news outlet connected to the Yonggang network. The audio was a ghost from a decade ago, the night of the Busan fire. The room heard the cold, calculated instructions Taegyu had given to the arsonists, his voice devoid of the loyalty he had once feigned. They heard him laughing as he discussed the cleansing of the no bloodline. Then, the screens shifted to the present, displaying a live feed of the restaurant's hidden ledger, showing the systematic siphoning of the syndicate's pension funds into Taegyu's private offshore accounts. The unmasking wasn't just a revelation of his crimes, it was a surgical removal of his mask of Mafia honor. "You told them you were the protector of the family," No-Rin said, her voice cutting through the recording of his past sins. She stood at the head of the table, the blue light of the screens reflecting off her clouded eyes, making them glow with a celestial fire. "But you were just a parasite, Taegyu. You didn't build this empire, you bled it." Outside the glass walls, the city watched. In the bars, the docks, and the police stations, the legend of the lion died a public, humiliating death. The men standing in the shadows of the hallway, the enforcers who had been the backbone of his power, stepped into the light of the boardroom. They weren't looking at Taegyu with fear anymore, they were looking at him with the cold, clinical disgust reserved for a traitor. Taegyu turned to the windows, looking for an escape, but his reflection was gone, replaced by the scrolling names of the men he had betrayed. He was stripped of his rank, his wealth, and the fear he used as a shield. The unmasking was complete. He stood in the center of the room, a naked, trembling man who had finally run out of lies. Rin didn't need to see his face to know the moment his spirit broke. She could hear the silence of a man who realized that while he had been playing for the throne, she had been playing for the truth. And the truth had finally spoken. The descent of Taegyu was not a cinematic plunge from a height, but a slow, agonizing dissolution of his very existence. He stood in the center of the boardroom, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to catch the fragments of the power that had just evaporated. The recordings of his betrayal continued to loop, a digital heartbeat that grew louder with every passing second. He looked toward his lieutenants, men who had once killed at his whim, but they stood with their arms crossed, their faces as stony and indifferent as the mountain peaks of the old country. "I made you." Taegyu screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "I gave you everything. You owe me." A heavy, suffocating silence followed his outburst. It was broken by the general, who stepped from the shadows near the door. He didn't draw a weapon, he simply held out a small, black velvet bag. With a flick of his wrist, he emptied the contents onto the walnut table. A dozen gold signet rings clattered across the wood, the insignias of the district leaders Taegyu thought were in his pocket. Each one had been returned voluntarily. The message was clear, the syndicate had not been conquered by force, it had simply walked away from him. "You gave them nothing but fear, Taegyu," the general said, his voice a low rumble of judgment. "And fear is a currency that devalues the moment the lights come on." Rin stepped forward, her white cane tapping once against the floor, a sound like a gavel in a silent court. "The fall of a king usually leaves a vacuum," she whispered, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But you were never a king. You were a squatter in a house built by an honorable man." Taegyu's legs finally gave out. He collapsed to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold mahogany of the table he had once commanded. He was stripped of his rank, his assets frozen by the general's digital strike, and his reputation incinerated by the archive. He looked up at Rin, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He realized then that she wasn't going to kill him. That would be too merciful. She was going to let him live as the very thing he loathed most, a man with no name, no shadow, and no one to fear him. As the authorities finally ascended the elevator, alerted by the archive's final data dump, the enforcers stepped aside. They didn't resist. They watched as the lion was hauled to his feet by two patrol officers, his expensive suit rumpled, his dignity a shattered ruin. He was led away not as a legendary crime boss, but as a common thief caught in the act. Rin stood at the window, the rain finally subsiding, her clouded eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. The boss had fallen, and for the first time in 10 years, the city's heart began to beat with a rhythm that was no longer his. The transition was not marked by a coronation, but by a restoration of the soul. In the days following Amtagu's arrest, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked the city for a decade lifted like a fever. The Young Gang headquarters, once a fortress of paranoia, transformed. The cold, obsidian surfaces were warmed by the light of open windows, and the scent of jasmine and sandalwood replaced the stale smell of fear. No, Rin did not sit in the high-backed chair at the head of the boardroom table. Instead, she had it removed, replacing the symbol of singular tyranny with a circular table where the old guard and the new generation could sit as equals. Her reign began with a quiet, surgical precision. She used the archive not to blackmail, but to repair. Funds that had been siphoned into offshore accounts were quietly returned to the community projects and pension funds Tegu had looted. The syndicate, once a predator upon the city, shifted back to its ancestral roots, a protector of the shadows, governed by the strict code of honor her father had died to defend. Rin moved through the halls with the same serene grace she had possessed as a flower girl, her white cane a scepter of truth rather than a badge of disability. One evening, Rin stood on the balcony overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. The general stood a respectful distance behind her, watching the silhouette of the woman he had helped forge in the fires of exile. "The city is breathing again, Rin," he remarked softly. "The shadows are aligned. My father always said that the strength of a tree isn't in its height, but in the depth of its roots," she replied, her voice carrying the resonance of a leader who had found her true north. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small packet of seeds, wildflowers, like the ones Tegu had crushed in the restaurant. She scattered them into the wind, watching them vanish into the city below. She was no longer the blind girl of the flower markets or the ghost of a murdered mentor. She was the heiress, a sovereign who saw more with her heart than her enemies ever did with their eyes. Under her guidance, the No family name was restored to its former glory, etched once more in the foundations of the city's honor. As the stars began to pierce through the twilight, Rin turned back toward the warm light of the office. The hunt was over, the debt was paid, and the reign of the Jasmine Rose had only just begun.